So welcome everybody back to the Health Mastery Show. This is the first episode of 2022. It's crazy to think that it's been 3 years, or at least this is the third year of the podcast, and it only seems like last week that it was 2019 when I started this, and I guess that's been kind of muddled by the pandemic and lockdowns and working from home and everything like that. I'm sure everybody feels the same, but I really do appreciate everybody who's listened from the start, and everybody even who listens sporadically, or is this their first time they've listened to the podcast. I really appreciate it. It keeps me going, gives me drive to keep getting on guests and spending these hours editing and recording, and I really appreciate all the feedback that I get, and that is genuine. Today we have on a great guest. His name is Dr. Peter Tierney, and we talk all about something that I think is quite topical at the moment, and that is gadgets and wearables and how useful they are actually to the average person, but also somebody who's, say, like an amateur or even a professional athlete. So it's just gone past Christmas a few weeks ago, and before that it was Black Friday. A lot of people will have these wearable devices like Fitbits, Apple Watches, Oura Rings, Whoop, you name it. There's loads of different ones, and there's even more coming on the market. And there's more as people get more discretionary income and technology makes these things cheaper. There's more and more devices on the market. So we really dive deep into like what's actually useful, because you probably have something today that reads stuff that you're not even sure what the use of that is. So really interesting topic. But before we get into the show, I want to talk quickly about a beta program that I'm running. So I don't know if I've mentioned this before on the podcast, I maybe have, but ever since I left my first degree back in 2014, I've been working in the technology industry, and other than a brief period for a year or two where I went to open a gym, I've been working in that industry. And during that time, I've actually prepped multiple times in my natural bodybuilding, as many of you will know, having following the show. But I often get people reaching out to me, and many of the clients that I do work with are people who work in that services, white-collar industry. And there's a lot of struggles that are quite unique, and it's different than getting advice, let's say, from someone who's a personal trainer or is only, say, an online coach and that's all they do. There's a lot of different things you need to navigate when you are working in a position that you either work long hours at a desk, or you need to go and visit clients all the time, you need to be social, you need to travel, etc., etc. So this is a program designed for people who want to get into great shape, but also can't sacrifice certain things because of their job, and that's obviously a priority for them as well. So it's a one-to-one coaching service. If you're interested, just check out the link, and we need to have a call so that we can make sure this is the right program for you, but also to make sure that I can actually help you as well. So click that link, it's in the show notes wherever you're listening to this, and we can have a chat. But without further ado, then let's get into this podcast with Dr. Peter Tierney. Peter, thanks for coming on, man.
Well, cheers for having me.
So this is the first podcast of the new year, so appreciate you joining me. And we've got a really interesting conversation today. I saw some of your posts about wearables, and it's definitely something that I'm really interested in. I've bought loads of wearables actually just before Christmas. I was thinking of buying the Oura Ring, even though it's like, I don't like wearing rings, and it's like, I don't know, €350 or something like that. But, you know, when you get this disposable income, you don't know what to be doing with it. And funny story, I was actually sitting beside somebody I work with at dinner a few months ago in London, and he had a Fitbit or an Apple Watch on one arm and then like a Whoop on the other arm, and he was saying, hopefully this gets me into shape now, because like I'm just going to be tracking my data. And the guy's like, you know, he's overweight, like, but it's just funny about how people with you know, in these days are spending so much money on these wearables, but often don't necessarily have any impact. And we're seeing more and more things like blood glucose monitors, etc. So really interested to hear your input on these today. But without starting that, let's get a bit into your background. So it'd be great to hear about like where you are now and how you got there.
Yeah, cheers, Adam. So currently my role is a senior research scientist at Lululemon. So I'm in Ireland right now, but relocating to Vancouver very soon, which will be exciting. So a bit of a pivot. I've always been researching, but I've previously worked in sport. So most recently, for just over 2 years, I worked in the English Football Association as a sports scientist and physical performance coach. So that was a kind of a hybrid role where the sports science involved or included some project work that sort of influenced teams from seniors right the way down to 15s, men's and women's. and then a lot of delivery on camp when teams were playing matches or training camps. And then prior to that, I spent 5 years working in Leinster Rugby as a sports scientist and sort of like assistant performance coach as well. So again, a hybrid role where coaching, delivering, but also a good emphasis on sports science research and I guess technology sort of embedded within that as well. And then throughout that, the last 8-9 years, or 10 years actually, sorry, I did my undergrad degree in UCD in health and performance science. So again, maybe not as like it's quite a broad degree. So not as focused, say, on either health or sports science, but a little bit of both, which is good. Did a master's in research then when I was working at Leinster on GPS technology, and then just finished my PhD. Well, I feel like I finished it ages ago, but I only actually graduated in December. I just happened to be in person before this, kind of restrictions and stuff, which is great. So I got my parents up to that, which I'm very grateful for. And yeah, just I guess the wearable, the technology stuff has always been kind of an interest of mine, and obviously part of different roles and stuff as well. So that's probably where I've come to now. But the health wearable stuff has definitely sort of exploded as a result of the pandemic, I think.
And what kind of research do you do in Lululemon? I've only ever, well, I don't have much knowledge of it. Just you're probably aware, but I think the first store just opened in Dublin. I only saw it about a month ago. I don't think it's there that long, but I would have just thought that was like yoga pants and gym t-shirts and stuff. So it'd be interesting to hear what research they do. I don't know, maybe they have a wearable line, something like that.
Well, yeah, I mean, even some of my friends and stuff and former colleagues, when I told them I was leaving the FA and I'd taken up a position with Lululemon, they said, isn't that just the women's leggings brand? They don't even know like there's men's clothing and apparel. Obviously, like largely speaking, yes, it's an apparel company, and yeah, the store just opened in Dublin. I went into it before Christmas, but I'm actually going in to meet some of the staff next week, which would be good. So yeah, first kind of standalone store in Ireland, which is nice to see. But my role is within the product innovation team, and specifically on advanced concepts. So Lululemon definitely consider themselves like an innovative company, and from what I've seen so far, I've only been working for them for a few weeks, but it definitely is that case. It's a very forward-thinking company. And I guess the clear example, obviously primarily it is an apparel company, but the breadth of some of the newer things that Lululemon have done, they've acquired a digital fitness company called Mirror, which is like, as it's described, an at-home mirror. It's pretty much an invisible gym, but within that there's like loads of features. You can do workout classes and everything else. So that's definitely like a portal into some new avenues for Lululemon. And there's loads of other things as well. Like, yeah, there's been loads of research done on products and wearables, whatever else. But there is a lot of research that goes into the apparel. So it's not just, they don't just stick like random performance claims or labels onto different colors and say that, this is, you should buy our pants over this other company. So it's actually like research and testing that goes into those performance claims. So some of the role will be involved in doing that as well.
That's interesting. I mentioned to you just before we start recording. Well, the only reason I bought them is because when I try and bend down in normal jeans, they just end up bursting in the crotch area. So and they're pretty comfortable. So I don't think they're necessarily they're gonna improve my performance in anything, but they're gonna just last me longer. So yeah. So
actually, I've read a study, literally nothing to do with Lululemon, but I read a research study like 2 days ago, which compared like cycling performance in like synthetic clothing versus cotton, and it did actually have a performance improvement. So your clothing could actually have an impact on your performance as well.
Yeah, I just won't be wearing them in the gym because they're supposed to be like kind of semi-formal wear. I actually did see a guy though years ago in the gym wearing suit pants and suit trousers, or suit shoes that you'd wear with a suit. He obviously forgot his, like, and they're pinstripe as well. He obviously forgot his gear. I don't know if that was a performance thing, but yeah. So on the wearables, like I mentioned before, like I was considering buying like the Oura Ring. I'm wearing one of the Fitbits now, which I've always used. I have a what are they called? The Polar chest straps. I've got a lot of other stuff that I bought. But really, this is the only one that I actually use. But Well, what is on the market today, and like what are the most popular ones?
So many, and like honestly, every week I seem to come across like a new wearable or like a new company that produces a wearable or claims something. So tons of stuff. The most common ones are probably like, well, your smartwatch is probably the most common one. So you've listed a few there, but like Apple Watch, Fitbit are definitely like two of the most popular that I've experienced and seen a lot of like friends and colleagues and network that use. I'm currently using an Apple Watch. One predominantly as a watch. There's a lot of functionality between it and my iPhone, so it makes life a bit easier for sure. And secondly, yeah, as an activity tracker. So there's a lot of these that do collect a lot of information that aren't necessarily validated. The Apple Watch for heart rate anyway and movement, from what I've seen, is quite accurate. So that's what I'm using during the day. I do have an Oura ring as well, so I wear that just at night time. I do wear it during the day sometimes, but it's mostly just a sleep tracker for me. But yeah, there's like tons of other things. Like your phone, to be honest, is actually probably one of the best wearables that a lot of people have that maybe don't even utilize fully. So it's actually scary the amount of activity and health data that your iPhone collects on you. If you click into Apple Health and just scroll through all data, you kind of get a bit overwhelmed at like a lot of the stuff that it collects. But you even touched on it as well. Like there's some continuous glucose monitors that are starting to come out. I've seen some sweat sensors that are measuring like sweat and hydration levels. I think there's probably it's going to reach a point where it's not necessarily like the data that they're collecting. Well, one, they'll improve the accuracy, but it's like what you do with it. So I think the next sort of like line of things will either be wearable companies putting more money and effort into like the behavioral aspects and actions off the back of it, as opposed to just collecting the data. Because like you said about the person you met in London, like you can buy all these things and put them on, but if you don't do anything with them or like change behaviors or make a plan to improve anything, like fair enough, you're collecting data, but like you're not doing anything with it, so it's a little bit pointless. So like there's some like initial thoughts on it, but like most of what they measure is reasonably similar across like different brands or different technologies. Like most of them have an accelerometer that measure movement, so i.e. count steps. Most of them are collecting heart rate data, whether that's 24/7 like Whoop does, or whether it's overnight like an Oura ring, or whether it's kind of sporadically throughout the day or just during exercise. So they'd be two of the most kind of common variables that a lot of people measure.
So one of the ones that some of the ones that I've seen recently, because I was actually going to upgrade this watch because my previous one broke, and I could either just replace it because it was in warranty or get like a voucher to put towards a new one. And the newer ones tracked your oxygen levels, or SpO2, and like I think they may have tracked heart rate variance as well, which this doesn't. So I'm wondering, like, what about those things? Are they useful for the average person? Are they useful for athletes even? I know that there's other apps that can, or other tools that can track those things. And a lot of the new wearables, or say updated versions of wearables, will start to add, they basically just start adding more features. Obviously, like you mentioned, they're fine tuning the accuracy of the current things that they measure, but then they're starting to add all these extra things. Like I'd never seen an SpO2 monitor before. I saw one at the start of COVID because people were using their fingers to measure the oxygen levels to see if their lungs are still functioning. Yeah. But how useful are those two things?
Yeah, HRV is definitely more commonly measured one now. Like Oura Ring, Whoop are claiming to measure HRV. There's also there's a phone camera app that measures that and has been validated. So that's pretty worth mentioning. HRV for Training is the app, which you can use in the morning. And there's other things as well, like there's body temperature, which is one, and respiratory rate. And one of the other things, apart from which we can talk about more, like in terms of why you'd use a wearable, but some of these variables have come up as detecting like illness, and in some cases, yes, COVID as well. So it's not to say it's going to predict everything perfectly or whatever else, but certainly temperature and respiratory rate are two that I've seen a lot of people, and there is some research that's been published, when they've changed significantly, they usually flag or sort of occur with like an illness such as COVID. So that can be another use of them as well.
Yeah, and like I've always been, I'm quite skeptical, just in general, and obviously as you know yourself, you've done a PhD. When you do kind of when you're involved in research, whether that be masters or whatever, a PhD or different, you do have to have some sort of healthy skepticism. And I like this morning, for example, I haven't been drinking coffee for like a few weeks, trying to cut down the caffeine massively. But this morning I woke up really early, went to the gym, and I don't know why, but I had two coffees. I had a double coffee, and I got home from the gym, and obviously it takes a while for the caffeine to kind of hit peak levels in your blood, and I just felt very, very anxious. But I probably could have looked at my watch and seen that my heart rate was up, but I could feel anxious. So like, and then I like just did some breathing to just kind of relax, and it was fine. But the same goes for like, if I had a tool that told me that like, okay, now you're hungry. I don't need to know if I'm hungry, or I don't really need to know if I'm thirsty. Maybe that's just me, but what are your thoughts on these things that are telling us stuff that our body, which is an amazing organism, is actually finally in tune to do, and has evolved over, I don't know how many years humans have been around, hundreds of thousands of years.
Yeah, like I kind of hear people or talk with this a bit. Like, I don't think these like wearables or this data is here necessarily to replace like you feel like in terms of like hunger or like anxiety or sleepiness or whatever it is, but it's certainly there like as well as and like a lot of people compare, say, your subjective feel of whatever variable to an objective measure from a wearable, but they're not necessarily always supposed to correspond. And that's where some of the wearables can have a benefit. Like, for example, if you're training and you're consistent in your training, you train 4 days a week, you're very like rigid in your routine or whatever else. So okay, like today's a high training day, tomorrow's a rest day, whatever else. But some of the wearables then, like you'll know like you have to recover today, tomorrow after today's session, and then you'll train again in 2 days' time. But some of the wearables then can detect stress from outside of training, which is something that some people maybe don't consider as much. So that could be like family stress, relationship stress, work stress, which, people get very good, particularly people that go to the gym a lot, at even just self-quantifying like gym stress. So, okay, if today was, I don't know, what's you doing in the gym today, like lower body, you did like 5 sets of squat, deadlift, whatever it is, and you know what your stress is from that day, but sometimes you may not think about the stress from other parts of the day. Even if you're presenting or something, that can be a bit of stress on you. So they don't always necessarily have to align in terms of what you feel and what objective data there is. But I wouldn't replace one with the other. I'd consider both of them. And sorry, one more point on that is sometimes people get a bit bogged down and like trying to make a change very, very quickly so it'll be like the one I hear all the time is like, oh, like to sleep better, like take magnesium. And I'm not saying that doesn't support sleep, but like people take something once and then expect it to like fix all of their problems like immediately, and then they look at their wearable data the next day and they're like, oh, this doesn't change anything. I'm like, yeah, well, like give it a few months, make some big changes. And it's the same with health, HRV, resting heart, anything like that. It's the same progress in the gym. Like, you don't do one session and come back and expect to be, like 5 times stronger. So it's trying to take a longer term view with all of this stuff.
Yeah, I do. I definitely understand where you're coming from there. Like I've definitely read some research on external stress. I think one or two of the papers were around students doing their final exams, and they weren't able to recover as well when they were doing exams during the exam period. So obviously, if you knew about this and you knew how to program your training and all of these things, and I coach people, so that's helpful. That you might do less volume in the gym next. If you looked at your thing and said, oh, my readiness score is like, I don't know if it's high or low is good, but anyway, it's not good. Maybe I'll reduce my volume. But even very intelligent people, they're not necessarily data scientists or know that like, okay, because of this, I need to do this. And when you do get these devices, they don't often tell you like, okay, if your stress is high, then perhaps you should reduce your training volume, or maybe they do. What are your kind of thoughts on that? Because obviously, like you said, a lot of data, if you don't know how to interpret and then make use of that data, is it any useful?
Yeah, like some of the, like a lot of apps do send like messaging or if you wake up with whatever resting heart rate, it sort of suggests your status.
Yeah.
Some of those are kind of like pre-programmed and sort of make some pretty large assumptions. Some say they're wrong.
Shouldn't drank that half bottle of vodka last night.
Yeah, or like, sometimes, yeah, like if your HRV is increased, some of these apps and wearables are saying, oh, like you're primed to train, and that's happened to me before, but that happened to me like after a night of drinking, and I was like, I'm not training today. So like, I think what really people should consider, and I've seen and I've spoken to some companies and services and stuff that are doing this, is getting coach or like behavior guidance alongside the wearable data. So people buy these devices, but like there's nuances to interpreting every bit of data that comes with them and what to do with it and where to go with it. So I think the future of, or even the current, the present, and the future of these isn't necessarily like more wearables or different devices. It's like the wearables plus the coaching. So like if you like, I don't know, you wouldn't, somebody gave a good example. It was like, you wouldn't, you're not going to buy like if you're going to get a scan, like you need an expert to read the scan and to figure out what like the scan has taken. It's the same as like wearables and stuff. You need somebody who knows what stress is and what the different variables actually represent. So I think, like getting a coach. So if you're going to get a wearable, I would also consider getting a coach with it so that they can help you interpret it as well.
Yeah, that's a big increase in price versus just getting the wearable by itself. Before we kind of go on to like what ones you think are perhaps useful for people, what are your thoughts on continuous glucose monitors? Because I have heard them. Obviously, they've used in clinical settings. I know of diabetics, of type 1 diabetics. My family have friends who are type 1 diabetic. Often, obviously, they haven't had those before, but they kind of know when they're low or whatever or high. But obviously, that's a bit more accurate. But then you start to see it roll over into the mainstream where it's like, oh, you have to have your glucose, like, if your glucose is out of whack or something. That's not good. But like, obviously, if you're going to eat a bag of jelly beans, your glucose levels are going to go up, and if you fast, they're going to go down. Like, it's just normal. But people get obsessed about being perfect and that their body isn't this resilient organism that can actually control inputs and has a lot of homeostasis processes. So what are your thoughts on that? And even then within sports as well, because I do believe that I think even Leinster may have been using them for a while.
The continuous glucose monitors, I've used two over the last like 2 years maybe, out of interest. Like, I'm not, to my knowledge, I'm not like diabetic, so it wasn't like a prescribed thing to me, but it was out of interest. And I spoke to Dan Davey. He used one a good few years ago himself, like personally. There wasn't something that guys in Leinster have used, to my knowledge anyway, when I was there, or I don't believe that they are at the moment. But the continuous glucose monitors, I think, can be useful in certain situations to understand your response to certain foods. Because whilst, yes, we understand that like if you ate some jelly babies that your blood sugar is going to spike, some different foods can respond very differently to different individuals. And I think there was a study, I can't remember exactly, I think it was they got people to eat like a banana on toast or something, and the response, it was a large enough group, was different in like every single person. So understanding your own response to certain foods can definitely be useful. The continuous glucose monitors don't measure blood glucose. They measure glucose in like interstitial fluid. So there's like a delay in it as well. So like it won't be as, it'll lag behind like a finger prick, that sort of like standard measure. But what I find really useful on them is like relative changes. So like your blood glucose can increase during exercise, during stress, or obviously in response to food. And what I definitely found was like, if my meals weren't well balanced, so elements of protein and fat with carbohydrate, of course that resulted in an increase in blood glucose. But I've read some stuff, and from my own like experience using them, that you can mitigate or reduce that spike or response. And actually Dan Davey, who we were actually just chatting about before, he did a post on Instagram, I think, about blood glucose levels and trying to stabilize them and focusing on eating like well-balanced meals. But the reason for that he was describing was to avoid those sort of peaks and troughs of energy levels. So obviously if you eat a very high carbohydrate meal It's going to spike your blood sugars, but it's like really quickly, but it's also going to rapidly drop them afterwards.
It's
And
a
that usually
rebound
coincides
hyperglycemia.
with like low energy and low focus. So trying to avoid those is definitely useful. But some of the strategies that you can do, one, I think I said this to him as well, like prevent those big spikes by eating well-balanced meals. But if you do have those, you can reduce that spike by going for a walk after you eat. And I actually read some research as well. You can ingest some like lemon juice and vinegar and stuff, and acidic foods and liquids can help reducing that. So I know, sorry, that's probably gone slightly off the wearable side of things, but I think it was important to speak about those. But yeah, like I think they can be useful. I don't think you should be wearing a continuous glucose monitor every day for the rest of your life, but certainly as a check-in. So the sensors usually last 14 days. So I've done that twice over the last 2 years, just out of interest, to see like my response to certain foods, to if I walk after a meal, to different situations. So, you know, I'll probably use it sporadically over the next couple of years, but certainly not as a daily thing.
Yeah, and if you were trying to use that data to infer then how you feel, or if that's the reason why you're using it, because I want to feel a certain way or don't want to feel a certain way, as in don't want to feel brain foggy or low energy, surely then you could just actually cut that data tracking out and say, okay, I ate 2 packs of basmati rice for lunch and I felt very tired then afterwards, so I won't do that again, rather than saying, oh, my blood sugar's up. Or else, like, I know, I get what you mean. You and people have done this for years, where they've tracked foods when they had foods that kind of cause gut issues or the issues. They'll like make a food log and say, okay, I ate that, so probably shouldn't do that again. I guess this is just going a bit more in detail and giving you some physiological feedback rather than actually just subjective feedback.
Yeah, and like I wouldn't start with a glucose monitor. Definitely not. I would definitely start with like get a pen and paper, like you say, and write down a few things. Like write down like what your goal is, if it is like, because you can like a lot of these wearables, like they fit different purposes, but you have to actually establish like what you want to achieve or what your goal is. So if your goal is to avoid energy slumps, like have a look at what you do during the day. Write it down. Like write out your schedule. And like I say to some people as well, like if it's, a lot of people feel that kind of slump after lunch. I'm like, instead of trying to go for like a coffee, if you do go for a little stroll after lunch, see how that makes you feel. Right down the neck, so there's definitely more simple solutions to think about before jumping onto like a wearable, like a continuous glucose monitor. But in some instances, it can be a useful sort of objective measure.
Yeah, I remember when I used to be in the office, there would be like a food trucks on a certain day, and people would like the food literally like weigh 2 kilos, and it would probably be about 2,500 calories of like whatever food it was, like barbecue or paella or something, and then like people would be falling asleep, like, and they just lashing the coffees instant to try and stay awake, whereas they probably could have eaten a little bit less, but also just took a bit of a stroll around rather than just go straight back and sit down. And another one that I noticed recently, I think I mentioned over email, was, and you said you had some experience with like the GPS tracking, where they're selling that in like one of the sports shops. It's not even a sports shop; it's a clothing shop. But like, and that seems to be getting popular, the GPS trackers. And I did listen to a podcast a while ago with Shane Malone from the Dublin team who does the sports science there. He's actually in my school in my year, but he was saying like, getting people, like if players think they need to get their running up, they might just start running extra, but it doesn't actually have any meaningful difference in the game at all. They just want to get their score up. So I think like that can be very, not dangerous, but a waste of time, where a lot of people, if they don't know what they're doing with that data, they can actually just, they can be trying to get players to do certain things when they don't actually need to. They don't need to, it doesn't actually help them win the game. This is what they're trying to do. But yeah, so with regards to actual useful wearables, because it's now January, people are on a health buzz the same way they are every January. But what would actually be useful for them, for the average person, and then maybe somebody who's like, say, an amateur athlete, like what's actually useful for them to be tracking?
Yeah. Well, sorry, one thing on the GPS before we get into that as well, like, because I've done a lot of research on this in like previous roles and my PhD as well. That definitely probably started off, like you said, the skepticism around technology and stuff. Like, there's one, every piece of technology promises, like 100 different things, and then you have to go through this process of like seeing if it's actually accurate or not. So I've done a lot of work on GPS, and yeah, like I've seen the consumer. I've actually tried the consumer unit myself, but yeah, like it's only for like a very specific need, and in that instance, I definitely think someone needs to actually interpret the information for you, because something telling you that you ran more within the like may not mean anything in the context of the sport that you're actually performing or competing in. So yeah, that's definitely one where I think you need someone to help you interpret, as opposed to just getting it and saying, oh yeah, I sprinted more, I covered more distance, or whatever else.
But we lost 4-0.
Yeah, no, they can be useful. That's not to like disregard them at all.
Yeah.
But like definitely in certain circumstances with the right kind of guidance. In terms of like what, so then your question was like what wearables are useful. Like I think that it completely depends on your goals. Like, and you probably, if you send your coach and some people now, like you'll probably have different people coming to you with different goals. Like if, for example, if someone just wants to like increase their activity levels, like, okay, one, it's probably trying to map out a bit of a plan to do that, and then trying to define what it actually is. But your phone is probably enough for that. So if someone's very sedentary and they need to improve their activity levels, keep their phone in their pocket the whole day and like, assess number of steps, and then put in place a plan or training program, whatever it is, and then assess it throughout that, and then at the end of it, and see if you made any change. And that's like the most, say, basic element of it. But it does completely depend. If it's someone wants to improve their sleep, and again, it start with basics, or like a pen and paper, write down what time you go to bed, what time you get up in the morning, and have a look at your sleep consistency and try nail down those basics first. Some of the wearables can give you some insight.
Before you move on to the next ones, I think like they're pretty much the only two that I ask clients that I work with to track. But I think even I have friends that like have loads of tech gadgets, and like I know for a fact they don't get enough steps because they work from home, and like there's some sort of gamification when you have a step counter on your wrist, because I hadn't got one for about 2 months because mine broke. Mm-hmm. And I found that like I just wasn't walking as much. I knew consciously that I wasn't, but when you see like I've got a goal, I give myself a goal like 10,000. It's quite arbitrary, but gets me out about 3 times a day. And I like, if I'm not on that, I will go for a walk, even if it's like kind of raining and stuff. Whereas if I didn't have one, I probably wouldn't.
And that's a really positive, like, I think that's a positive like response from some of the wearables. And like that, the Apple Watch is really good for that, because one, it gives you a step count, but encourages you to move like every hour. So if you're like stationary for 50 minutes at like, say like 10 to whatever time it is now, like probably about now, like it'll buzz you to say, oh look, you need to stand up and move around a little bit. And definitely, like, I know people argue about like this 10,000 arbitrary number, and like it's great to set a goal, it's perfect, but there's loads of evidence for like higher daily step counts,
and mortality
risk, and so many different things. So whether it's an arbitrary number, and like I think you do need to set some sort of goal for yourself or target, but like definitely in steps up to a certain point, like 15, 16,000, like more is definitely better. So like move around as much as you can.
And then what about these other, say, more fancy things? Like I suppose the next most popular one that's on these devices is heart rate variance, and then maybe some others like SpO2. We kind of touched a bit about continuous glucose monitors already, but what about those other ones?
Yeah, so these devices or softwares that are assessing like heart rate and heart rate variability can be really useful. But again, there's really like definitely nuances to interpreting it. So it's not as simple as like my HRV is high today, I'm going to train all out, or my HRV is slightly lower tomorrow, I'm going to take a rest day. And these are the kind of things that you need to take into consideration for like medium and longer term. Like you can still train when your HRV is lower than your normal. Your recovery from it might be slightly hampered or delayed for a bit of time afterwards. But in like it's been reported in a lot of literature that a lot of people on competition day report a lower HRV, and that can be from like competition anxiety or alertness going into competition. So it's not necessarily a bad. It doesn't, it's not going to stop people performing to their peak. And even in some like strength based like weightlifting, powerlifting athletes, that can be like completely, like the perception that a higher HRV is better is can be like very confusing. So some of those, can be like a little bit conflicting in terms of like messaging and stuff. And there's some days where you still need to train, and like if you have a training plan, you almost need to go against some of the wearable data and stuff. But some of them that measure, like one of the key things I guess for those is measuring consistently. So
I actually think I had an exact situation with a client like that, where he was like, I'm not recovered 100% yet between the two sessions. And I was like, well, that's not necessarily the goal, is to be always 100% recovered, because otherwise we just won't train ever, and then you'll be always recovered, So that's where you can kind of,
and also like that's probably the benefit of having a coach, because you're saying, well, like, you're committing to me for a 6-month plan. Like it's you're not trying to like improve health in 2 days. It's okay, you're trying to make progress across a longer term. So that's where like, some of the having a coach can actually be very beneficial to keep you on track for like the medium to long term, as opposed to trying to address everything in 1 or 2 days. But so one of the key things with any of these is just like being consistent with measuring. So that app that I mentioned, like taking a measurement every morning at the same time when you wake up, without drinking coffee before, or without doing whatever else. That's
so important. Would you suggest, like, sorry to cut across you there, but just on the HRV one, like, because that's I would say that's probably the one that most commonly available now, and what most people actually pay attention to, other than say your steps. So how would say somebody who's like, they go to the gym and they're also trying to like be as healthy as they can, but they still work and stuff like that, they're not like an elite athlete, but maybe they're a kind of amateur athlete, how would you use HRV data? Because obviously you said, like, if you have a coffee some days, like that might affect your score, or if you stay up really late. But you said also it's not always the goal to be getting it as low as, or getting as high as possible. So how would you interpret that for somebody trying to look at that data?
Yeah, so well, one, like so being consistent with how they measure it. So whether it's from an Oura ring or whether it's like a morning reading, just being consistent, using the same measurement, and just assessing that longer term. And then the primary thing I think is assessing like data points that are really outside of your normal range. So for example, even for resting heart rate, for example, the same with HRV, if your resting heart rate is 50 beats per minute, and obviously every day you'll have some variance, maybe plus or minus 2 beats per minute, 3 beats per minute. If you all of a sudden one day have a resting heart rate, whether it's through an Oura ring or an Apple Watch overnight, of 60 beats per minute, it's probably something to like flag and say, okay, well, like, why is that? Now, if you had, like you said earlier on, half a bottle of vodka, haven't had that in a long time, like obviously then you can identify the cause of that. But for example, if your heart rate increases by 10 beats per minute, in that case, and you didn't drink the night before, and you didn't do anything that you can identify, well, then that's probably something, okay, like I need to maybe keep an eye, like is that sign of an illness coming on? Is that stress from something else that isn't training, that's like like elevating my heart rate? So it's the same with HRV. It's things really far outside of your sort of normal range, and that'd be what I would look at. And also there is some comparative or normative data for, age groups and stuff, which you can sort of compare from a heart rate perspective. Definitely HRV can be a little bit more influenced from like genetics, and it can be very individualized, but you can compare yourself to normative data. So if you're a 30-year-old, there's a range of heart rate that, you should be in for a healthy range. So they'd be the 2 or 3 kind of key principles, I think.
Yeah, imagine having a meeting with your manager, like, sorry, my HRV was elevated because of you yesterday, so I'm not going to be doing this work. That'd be quite funny.
That'd be the
but what about the other ones then, other measurements, like you mentioned kind of respiratory rate and oxygen levels. Are these any use for the average person? I guess a lot of these probably tie in again to your sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous system. So they probably, when one goes up, a lot of them go up, right?
Yeah. The SpO2 one is one I definitely want to read a bit more about. I've seen a lot of people talking about it, and I understand what it is, but in terms of utility, like for the most part, I think SpO2 readings are, between 95 and 100% of like blood oxygen levels. So, definitely want to explore that one a little bit more myself. And like, say, for example, the Oura ring, the newer generation one, they're going to introduce that this year. So I think you'll start to see a bit more data collected, and then people trying to understand it a bit better. The respiratory rate is definitely one that I've I've seen, like a lot of people reporting from Whoop and Aura that's increased with like a positive COVID case or an illness. So it makes sense. I mean, like a respiratory illness increases your respiratory rate. And that's usually a metric that's quite stable. So certainly in that case, like again, there's tons of examples you can see online. If your respiratory rate is 15 breaths per minute normally, and it jumps to 17, well, there's some sort of stress on your respiratory system that you maybe need to consider. And like this, it's never going to be perfect. It's not going to detect every single illness or whatever else, but it certainly is like a case where changes in respiratory rate and body temperature and HRV and resting heart rate can certainly potentially flag illness, which I think is a really good use. So whether you look at your data like obsessively every morning or not, from a wearable, like the illness detection one is definitely one that like a benefit that I see that's sort of been highlighted over the last 2 years for sure.
Yeah, like in a utopian world, there would be like one that measures your body weight and your body fat level increase and everything, and then like only dispenses a certain amount of calories for you and makes you do a certain amount of exercise. Maybe in the metaverse, who knows? But at that point, probably be all just on the couch anyway, obese, pretending we're in shape. So, it's been great to have you on, Peter. Let us know a little bit more about like what you're up to and where can people find more about you.
At the moment, just kind of working in the new job, getting settled in, and then I'll be relocating pretty soon. So that's going to be a bit of I think a bit of getting used to, and then even just researching what I'm doing at the moment, like just kind of reading and researching a lot of things around health, and some wearable stuff. So I try to share some of that on social media. Like I'm on Twitter and Instagram, so just kind of starting to share some more stuff on that now. Like I wouldn't say I've been very active in the last couple of years, but certainly trying to share a bit more stuff because I'm learning tons from it myself as well. So hopefully if I learn something or find something useful that somebody else does as well. So I'm on both of those.
And what are your handles on those?
I think I'm Dr. Peter Tierney on Instagram, and then Twitter is Peter Tierney 93.
I'll share them all in the show notes anyway. But thanks a lot, Peter. Good to have you on.
Yeah, cheers, Adam. Thanks for the invite.